All right, let me keep going here. All right, I want to introduce this topic by a little story that I call Tide Pools and Insects. And I would say that my first sort of brush up against eco anxiety and grief comes from two stories. The first story was I grew up in Europe, and as a kid, I remember taking long drives with my parents and remember after every ride in the car, especially in the evening, the windshield would be filled with insects, and that my parents would have to clean the windshield of the car. And just recently, I had this memory come up, and I thought to myself, that's not happening anymore. I don't have that I have to clean the windshield. There's not that many insects right now when I drive in the evening that will bang against the windshield. So that was kind of a real discovery for me, noticing just the changes in my lifetime. But I would say one of the more profound emotional experiences for me was my husband and I did a trip out to British Columbia, where we got to experience some of the marine wildlife. And then also we got to a section where we got to see these tide pools. And these tide pools were just simply alive with the starfish and just these different, just wonderful beings. And when my son decided to go to school there, I was really excited to show him these tide pools. He likes photography, and so we ended up going out there to the same spot that was in my memory from about 10 years ago. And when we got to the tide pools, they were empty. There was nothing in those tide pools. I was devastated because I was so excited to show it to my son. And so the picture that you see here, this is just not what we saw in the tide pools. And I think the emotional impact for me was that noticing that my own, these experiences in the beauty of nature, that some of these are no longer happening for our own children. So this is where we start, right? With our own experiences. You have your own stories. Yours might not be by tide pools and insects, but we all have this, those experiences of sadness as we're seeing our environment change. So when we're looking at eco-anxiety and eco-grief, it really starts with the sense of anxiety caused by the dread of the environmental perils, especially climate change. And then the grief is what we feel in relationship to experiencing these ecological issues. I took these out. The grief part, when we're looking at grief, it's like the human response to grief. It often follows a what we call the human grief response. There's sometimes this numbness and denial, and then when that lessens, then we see underneath really these difficult emotions like anger and pain and tears, fear and guilt, anxiety, sleep problems. But at some point in the grief response, we do try to make accommodations and life goes on. What grieving people need is their pain needs to be witnessed, and we want to help to identify and express what they are feeling, right? So when we're translating this to the grief that we feel about the environment, one of the things resonates here is we need the pain to be witnessed. And we need to find community around it. We need to help each other being able to express these stories, like my story in the beginning. We all have them. And we want to be able to find a group of people that can resonate in some way. Joanna Macy is a big influence on this field, and she says, the trouble we're in today is not due to the most people being callously indifferent or ignorant. It's because most people fear the pain. So they push the grief to the far reaches of the soul. Thought that was really interesting. So what Joanna Macy says, it's not that people just don't care about it. It's that if they really think about it and feel it, the pain is so big that they end up pushing it away. So this is where really the psychological response comes in. When we don't run from our feelings and with courage face the pain, hold it with compassion, they reveal the other side of pain, aliveness and love. So really what the psychological response often is to this eco-despair is we have to get people to a place where they are willing to face it, to lean in and experience their feelings. Another personal example of that is, so my son, as I said, was leaving to school to Vancouver, and I experienced the empty nest for the first time. And what I noticed that my response to that is about 6 weeks before he would leave, I was already kind of caught up in the anticipatory grief of it. I thought all the time about what it's going to be like when he's gone, and was just worried about it and wondering how I'm going to manage. And all along, he was still present. And yet in those 6 weeks leading up to it, I was already checked out. And we really don't want to do this with our grief, right? Anticipatory grief. There is still beauty now. There are still things we can do now. We want to show up to our pain, but also show up and do something. What I noticed with the intro question, what brings you hope? A lot of you put into the chat that when you do something, right? Plant wildflowers, educate children. And that's a really important piece. They're still showing up and not being caught by these difficult feelings that can rob us from the present moment. Knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. So what we end up doing at the Center for Nature-Informed Therapy is we integrate nature into mental health treatment for people that have anxiety, that are bereaved, because they, in that healing process, they get to know and love nature. And once nature becomes a part of their healing process, they're much more interested in caring for the earth. So how do we not get overwhelmed by these feelings of grief? Well, one thing we have to know is when we get anxious, we go into fight, flight, or freeze response. And when we're in fight, flight, or freeze response, we are not the best version of ourselves. We're basically taken over by our emotions, right? We're all emotion and no prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that's actually reasonable and helps you problem solve and analyzes. So what we want to do is we want to help people stay in the window of tolerance. So the planet needs you to remain in the window of tolerance. When we stay in that window of tolerance, that's when you're at your best version and you don't get overwhelmed by the feelings. Because when you get overwhelmed, you're either turn into hyperarousal, when you become anxious, angry, you feel out of control, you feel overwhelmed, or you can hypoarousal, and that's when you kind of zone out, you numb, you're kind of frozen, your body wants to shut down. So that's no help for us, as we want people to be engaged, right, in sort of this climate activism. We need people to stay in the window of tolerance. Well, how did people do that? So 3 ideas: the here and now, feeling felt, and naming, claiming, taming. Idea 1 is really staying in the present moment. Our mind likes to be in the future. It's the what if, worst case scenario, right? We play it all out into the future. The past is connected to depression. It's when we ruminate and want to do things differently and all that. Anxiety is related to the future. The present moment is where we actually see mental health flourish. We want to try to stay anchored in the present moment. The truth is, even our climate scientists that are telling us statistics and all that, the truth of it is, though although we have these predictions, we don't know for sure how it's going to play out. And yet we spend so much time in the worst case scenario world. Doesn't help anyone. We want to stay in the here and now and see what we can do now. I love this quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who says, "Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair. Not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. You can choose joy over despair. It's a radical decision to choose joy, because the earth deserves that you choose joy over despair. We need you to choose joy. Idea 2, feeling felt. Humans need to be in community. This is who we are as humans. We're social beings. We need connection, community, and acceptance. I work with some people that have very, very severe eco-anxiety. They're totally paralyzed in that. And one of the things that's been very helpful to them is find communities where they can talk with other people about climate issues. There's something called a climate cafe that meets several times a year. I think it actually meets monthly online. And the idea is for people just to share their feelings around eco-anxiety. There's no call to action during those meetings because they want to create space for people just to build community around their concerns and knowing there are other people out there. Idea 3 is to name it. We have to be able to name it. Name the fears, name the pain. We take responsibility for it, and through that responsibility, we end up taming it. Some of the helpful perspectives that I've been taught by my own clients, some people have found that the perspective that the planet has lived through 5 mass extinctions, life has always found its way back. Although the sadness and the pain is around the losses that we're going to witness, right? But nevertheless, life has, through many mass extinctions, found its way back. And for some people, that's a solace. We also don't know the future. Although the odds are not in our favor, the same was true for George Washington, Nelson Mandela, Abe Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Gandhi, King David. There are many stories in human history where the odds were not in our favor. And at the end of the story, there is some resolution. I had an interesting interaction with a physics professor who actually came in for a loss of wife. His wife had died after 40 years of marriage and was really struggling with the grief. And it ended up being very helpful to him to remind himself of the first law of thermodynamics. What he taught me was that the first law of thermodynamics is that energy, once created, can't disappear. It changes form, right? So in his conceptualization was that his wife and her spirit and her energy was still around. It had just changed form, and that in some way her energy was still around, and there was a solace for him. And he said that in some way, as the earth transforms, right, through this crisis, that there's still hope, because the energy that the earth has doesn't dissipate. It just transforms in some way. So these were some of perspectives that people have found helpful. All right, so I'll turn it over to my son to give us some of his thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm Peyton, as was mentioned. I'm studying conservation at the University of British Columbia. And I started here with just a brief context of what I'm going to be talking about, which can seem quite grim, but I was brought here sort of with the goal of explaining why I'm still hopeful and why people should still hold hope. So that's sort of the theme of what I'm going to be talking about. Throughout the timeline of the changes that the Earth systems have gone through since we've been around, which you can see listed here ever since sort of the domestication of fire and agriculture and industrialization. We have done a lot of things to the planet to change it. There have been plenty of extinctions and lots of changes of land cover and so on and so forth. But I think that most people stop there when they visualize what has been going on to the planet, which I think is sort of doing an injustice in your mind and an oversimplification, because it's not just a one-sided power dynamic between humans and the planet. It's not just this ball of rock that we've been pummeling with all these changes. the Earth is a massively complex system of so many other systems, and it's doing so much that we don't even understand yet. And so to say that it's just sort of sitting there and taking it is really misleading. And the Earth has undergone many changes throughout the changes that we have put on it. And really, nature is so regenerative, and it constantly is trying to adapt, and it's constantly trying to fix the situation wherever we let it. So like a common example is some recent research that just came out about new generations of forests, how as they grow older, they're actually capable of sequestering carbon much faster than old forests, because they have adapted to the environment that humans are creating, where there's more carbon to be sequestered. And that's just one example of many about how the Earth systems adapt and make changes to the world around them, and how capable nature is at regeneration and helping out. So nature actually is not just the victim. Nature is really the tool as well when we're in the fight against climate change. Most climate studies have agreed upon the major solutions that sort of need to take place in order to mitigate the crisis. And three of the ones that keep continuing to pop up are listed here: stopping deforestation, restoring natural ecosystems, and improving agricultural management. And all of these sort of have a common thread, which is allowing nature to come back and sort of do its thing. And the quote I have here is by a climate scientist who says, "This says that not only is large-scale protection and restoration of nature an option that we can still take, but if we do, we will see a major effect on our climate." And this is from last year. This is recent. So when I hear people, which I hear too often, people saying that they've lost hope, or that there is no hope, and that there's no way we can do anything about the planet, it really makes me quite angry, actually, and quite sad, because not only is that infactual and unscientific, but that sort of mindset is grossly unhelpful to such a large scale crisis as the one we're facing. And we really need the opposite mindset of what action can we take, because as this quote sort of agrees, the action is still possible, and now is the time. So why now in terms of climate panic? Because this whole sort of presentation about eco grief and eco anxiety, it's all pretty recent. People 10 years ago, climate change was a thing 10 years ago, but people were not freaking out. And I have to ask that question because I want to talk more about it. But even in the act of asking that question, I realize it sounds stupid to ask why now. We're sitting here and there's walls of fire and smoke overtaking our cities. Our neighborhoods are flooding. You go to the supermarket, the prices of groceries are shooting all over the place. So it's very evident that why everyone sort of is feeling this panic and this anxiety now. All of the effects are knocking on our door. They're in our face. This photo was taken yesterday from New York. So it's a very scary situation. But what I actually find interesting is that right now, climate change is not getting worse faster. Actually, if you go back a few years, climate change was worsening at its fastest rate. And if you look at several different ways of measuring things, we're actually now just starting to take meaningful steps to combat climate change. So people are really anxious right now just because we're feeling the effects, because effects have sort of a delayed response. That's how the Earth's systems work. But right now is not the worst time in terms of humans' effects on the climate that we've ever seen. So actually, there is more hope now than there was to be seen a decade ago. But right now is sort of more emotional. So I remind that to people when they sort of lose hope and they start to submit to eco grief. That actually now is the time to be hopeful, and now is the time where we're starting to see more hopeful evidence, and we're starting to have more opportunities to make meaningful change. So this is one example. I'm not going to throw too much hard statistics in here because it's not really that kind of presentation. But this is just one that I find really meaningful, and I think about a lot just personally. And this graph represents what climate scientists call relative decoupling, which is basically the idea that you can lower your CO2 emissions per dollar. So that's very important because the economy of major countries and just all the major countries in the world are going to continue to grow, and that can be unfortunate for the planet, but we can't really do anything about that. People are going to continue to have children, and countries are continue to make money, and new businesses are going to continue to be created. So countries are going to continue to grow, and there's nothing we can do about that. But what's important to see happening is that despite that growth, CO2 emissions go down basically per unit of growth. So this is actually already happening in Europe. The data is not crystal clear on the United States, but it's looking better than it was in the United States as well. So this is sort of just one piece of evidence that I point to when people say that the battle is lost and there's really no hope, because there's actually clear data right now that some things are getting better and we are making strides in the right direction. Do I look at this graph and smile and be happy? No, not really. What we're looking to get towards is absolute decoupling, which basically just means total CO2 decline, regardless of what the GDP looks like. But this is just sort of one thing that I can point to show that all hope is not lost and there's not reason to give up. So when we talk about the science and accepted science in the climate world, there's one source that sort of strikes at a higher level than all the rest, which is the IPCC synthesis report. And the IPCC is just the International Panel on Climate Change created by the United Nations. And every 2 years for the last 10, they have come together and created a giant report about climate change and its effect on the world currently. So the last one just came out. It's always a pretty big deal when a new one comes out in the climate world. But the last one just came out in March. And this one was a much bigger project than ever before, rightfully so, because we're seeing all of these crazy effects taking place. So they were really trying to get attention with this one. And it's 4,000 pages long. They compiled 14,000 different climate studies that had recently taken place. And 195 scientists from 195 different countries all over the world came together and built this consensus, which is in this paper. And all of these scientists, all of these countries all over the world agreed on every single line of this paper. So it's a consensus like we see in no other field in science, actually, of that size. So it's a really unique sort of global humanity effort to come and give us what we can accept as true in the scientific community, because there are all these different studies floating around and people are struggling to know what to believe. So this was a very important paper that just came out, and if anyone's interested in actually reading any of the science, they have some summaries that are easy to read, and it's linked in the resources at the end of this presentation. But I'm just going to focus on one little piece that I think has helped me sort of visualize climate hope and climate grief, which is what they call tipping points. So tipping points come from a theory called planetary boundaries theory, and it's basically the idea of measuring the effects of anthropogenic climate change in 7 different categories focused on 7 different systems on the planet. So this is a visual representation of the data that had been compiled in the IPCC report. And basically, the reason I like this to show to people is because it shows a clear visualization of the zone of uncertainty, or basically where they think these different tipping points are in each of the planetary boundaries. And what a tipping point is basically the zone where you pass, where scientists say if a boundary surpasses that zone, things will sort of spiral out of control. It will either be irreversible or the rate of change will be extremely fast compared to what we've seen previously. So, for example, for climate change, if the temperature of the Earth passes a certain point, which I believe is between 2 and 2.5 degrees Celsius, scientists predict that the permafrost would melt, and then it would trigger sort of a positive feedback loop where things would sort of spiral out of control temperature wise. And right now we're at about 1.5 degrees Celsius off the top of my head. But so that is illustrated there in the climate change planetary boundary. But there's 7 different of these tipping points that scientists are warning about. And when people come to me with the perspective of climate change is already irreversible and there's nothing we can do to change these things because, you know, it's too late. I love this graphic because it's sort of clearly not the case scientifically. This graphic has taken the data compiled by all of the recent studies, and it shows that, yes, there are some boundaries where we're in the zone of uncertainty, but it is definitely not too late. It's definitely the time to act now, and there is a rush, obviously, but it is not, we're not at the point of irreversible damage to lose all hope. And Will Turner here, it's his quote on the left side of the screen. He was interviewed about these planetary boundaries, and the interviewer asked, is it too late to take action? And his 2 words, I think, are very important to anyone who has felt those feelings of eco-anxiety and eco-despair. Not yet. So if it's not too late, what do we do? Well, the good news is we know the solutions and they're in our reach. A lot of people think, you know, we're searching for this secret technology that doesn't exist, some magic thing. That's not the case. As I mentioned earlier, most of what we have to do is just reversing the natural loss and sort of ecosystem management. And we already know how to do these things. We just have to work together and do them. Things like decarbonizing the energy and industry sectors. These are solutions that we already have and are currently being implemented on a smaller scale, but we just need to widen that process. So that's the good news. And you know, some big businesses are investing in some of these solutions. We need to see more of that, and we need to see that faster and more investment in all of that, obviously. We need to heighten the pace of these solutions, but we're on the right track. So what matters to us is what we can do as individuals, because at least for me, if you stop doing anything, that's sort of when the despair sets in, and that's sort of when you can start to feel hopeless and just anxious because you feel like it's out of your hands. The truth is that's not the case. It's not out of your hands, and what we do as individuals does matter, and it does make a difference. So you know, a lot of people tell me climate change is a systematic issue. I have nothing to do with it. It's the big corporations and it's the government. I have no control, and that simply is not the case. Every one of you, you are a voter, you are an employee, you are a shareholder, and all of those things are what makes the system move, and it changes the direction of the system. So use your power in those ways. Climate scientists also refer to what are known as pro-environmental behaviors, which is basically what you can do as an individual to make a difference in the fight for climate change. Small things like recycling and composting are private sphere actions. And then things that fall in the public sphere would be like advocating at a rally or writing to legislators or things like that. So these are all actions that we should not stop taking just because we think that the fight is hopeless. So to refer back to psychology for a moment, there's what we call the feel good, do good phenomenon. But basically, the better you feel about something, the more likely you are to do positive action and to make positive change. So that's why I'm mostly so passionate about making sure people don't lose hope, is because then you won't take action, and we need everyone involved in the fight. So retaining hope means keeping up action, which is what's truly important here. So the last thing I'll mention is what we talk about as self-efficacy, which is what conservationists refer to, and they're basically talking about perceived control over a situation. So how much do you think you as an individual can change? And there's people that spend their whole career studying this, and it has a lot to do with psychology and sociology, but they basically break it down into 3 different categories: interpersonal influences, which is basically your social expectations; there's structural determinants, which is basically your surrounding environment; and then there's social context, which is your politics and your economics. But basically, I can simplify it to sort of a visualization of yourself as a consumer or as a citizen. And a consumer is sort of someone who goes and they live in a place and they buy different things and they eat different things and they travel different places because they can afford it or because it makes them happy. It's the normal sort of thought process that we all have. But a citizen is someone who takes into account all of the effects of their actions, and they worry about their diet choices and how it all affects the planet and the country as a whole. So I just wanted to remind everyone that self-efficacy is important and that we all do have power in our own lives and in the fight as a whole, as citizens. And we do have more control than at times it would seem, especially when the effects of our previous actions are sort of knocking on our door. And I know it can be difficult and I know it can be scary, but at the end of the day, my parting thought is that it's almost immoral to lose hope, because it's unfair to those of us who have not, and it's unfair to those of us who have not stopped taking action. So that's sort of my perspective as a younger person who was born into this world. And there's always been, global warming since I've been around. But yeah, that's sort of my perspective on the issue.
Okay, the next one, yours too.
It's just resources.
Okay, some resources for you guys. I'm gonna go and talk about some last reflections on from my end. It's okay not to be an optimist or hopeful all the time, right? There can be days where you're not feeling particularly optimistic and hopeful, and that's okay. It's okay. It's not okay though to check out, right? The only wrong way to grieve is not to grieve at all. Holding hope can be exhausting, and it's okay for your heart to be broken, right? Small actions create an internal sense of possibility. So going back to the ability to do any small things, if it's planting wildflower, does give you an internal sense of possibility, and that keeps you in that window of tolerance. So we don't know how the story's going to end, right? There could be an unraveling, but it also could be that we're in time in history when it's a great revolution that we can be part of. And then some of the resources that you might be interested in, Robin Wall Kimmerer and Joanna Macy have been a big part of this work. And then there's also something called the Climate Psychology Alliance. And they do a lot of work, and they are the ones that set up these climate cafes for people to check in and just have a community to talk to about these issues. And Joanna Macy is going to be our final quote for today. And she says, "The sorrow, the grief, and rage you feel is a measure of your humanity and your evolutionary maturity. As your heart breaks open, there will be room for the world to heal." I love that quote. That is so good. This is my contact info. And just wanted to, give that to people. I'm going to stop the screen share so that we can, for the last few minutes, have a little bit of a conversation. If you have any questions or comments, reflections, we would love to hear from you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Heidi and Peyton. Let me put a spotlight on you for everybody. Do we have any questions for what I wanted to ask about guilt, because Peyton went in there at the last slide that you mentioned was the citizen versus consumer. And sometimes I just feel if I do something, I know because I'm in the midst of all of this information, and I know what's going on, and I know the consequences of my actions. And if I do something, I just feel so guilty. And that makes me feel bad because I know what I'm doing. Like if I take a trip, I'm like, well, I don't have to take a trip because now I'm putting in more CO2 into the air and things like that. Or something simple like, oh, I threw that away and I didn't recycle it. And so then all of those guilt points kind of build up in me. So how do you recommend dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the main focus of the citizen versus consumer thought process is basically the difference. The main difference is that a citizen thinks about all of their actions, and basically the danger is that you would blindly sort of go through all these things and not even think about it. So just the fact that you're weighing things and that you're thinking about it shows that you're not, doing this all the time, and you're not doing it intentionally. And that's sort of the big step that everyone needs to take. And from there, you're in a place to make more meaningful changes. I don't think it's helpful to anyone to sort of beat themselves up over, small things like you said, throwing something in the trash accidentally or things like that. But if you're in that state of mind, then you're already in the place where you might make bigger positive changes. And so I think that's sort of where the focus needs to be.
If you want to unmute and ask a question, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can put something in the chat box. Okay, Joe.
I have a question. Why did you choose British Columbia as a university to go to? And the next question is, do you live near British Columbia?
Yeah, so I chose the university for a couple of reasons. Partly because of the field that I'm studying. The school has sort of a world-renowned forestry department. Some of you may or may not be familiar with some of the staff there are
Susan Samard.
are famous, like Susan Samard, who wrote several big hitting books in the field, but also for some selfish reasons. I'm a climber, and they have some of the world's best climbing as well. So that's what I would do in my free time. So yeah, when I'm studying, I live in Vancouver.
Okay.
But
Were
Joe,
you-
they live in Towson, or they are out of Towson area. Is that correct?
Yes. Summer break right now.
Okay. So you decided to go out to the far west instead of stay locally in any of the universities nearby.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? How do we, I mean, when the doom and gloom is all around us in terms of media, do you recommend people just tune out?
I think there's a helpful medium, and I think there's a difference between staying informed, staying active, and what's referred to as like doom scrolling. So at some point, it's important to keep up with, the current science and the current goings on of the world. And I'll never, tell anyone to not be doing that. But I think what a lot of people do is sort of different than just staying informed. And there's a lot of just dwelling on certain cases, or just, spending far too much time, just looking at all the negatives. And it's not all negatives out there. So there is positive news, and it might not be shown like on the TV news, but it's certainly, on the internet in certain sources, scientific papers and such that are released in different articles, whether it's, in Nat Geo or wherever. But yeah, I think there's a happy medium there.
Yeah, I agree with some of the comments coming up, and it kind of piggybacks on that, because you were able to present to us current data, and that showed that we're not as bad off as we might think we are. We're at least the trends are going in, maybe in slowly, but in the right direction, turning the ship around.
I wanted to just make a short plug for the new book called The Outside Within. It just came out a few weeks ago, and it talks about people's intimate connection with the natural world and how that helped them overcome some mental health challenges like anxiety, PTSD, bereavement issues. And Peyton supplied the photography for the book. And so you might want to check it out. It's available on Amazon. Would love for you to check it out. It's called The Outside Within.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll do that. Julie, is that a hand up or a thumbs up? I didn't.
Yeah, that's a hand up. So,
No, it's
so I was wondering if you lead forest bathing hikes. I've heard a lot about that, and I mean, I sort of feel like I do that on my own. I live along the Patapsco River, and but I'd love to go on like a real one that somebody's leading. So
yeah, thanks, Julie, for that. We call it forest therapy, because we noticed that there's been some misunderstandings with the word bathing, particularly when I was invited to do that for Goucher College, and all the students thought it involved taking their clothes off. And when we clarified, the enrollment dropped down to just a few people. So we call it forest therapy, but yeah, we do. We are also advocates of the immersive nature experience, because it seems to be taking at least a day or two for us to really unplug and then take on those benefits. So we do retreats and things like that where we're out there for at least a few days. But when we do activities, we do forest therapy, and it's sort of a mindful engaging with the senses that the forest provides. There's a question from Tracy. How do we as a team support each other with our own grief responses with our animals in the current social environment of indifference? Yeah, so as part of that presentation today, really important with grief is that we find a community to really be able to hold each other with that. Being able to speak to each other, hold each other and with the pain. But we do need our tribe. Humans are social beings, and it's really isolating when we feel like there's no one that really understands it. But grief is one of those experiences that, it's just by feeling the actual pain that it starts lessening, rather than avoiding it or not, moving away from it.
And I'd like to, I always use as a tagline that the Natural History Society of Maryland is a community of the curious. So we try to provide a lot of opportunities to gather with folks and just also experience the hopeful side of things, the awe and wonder that can kind of feed into a healing process.
Yeah, we want to just thank everyone for spending the hour with us and with me and Peyton, and how we, as you can imagine, there's a lot of family dinners where we discuss these topics and encourage each other to stay hopeful. He provides a lot of the science. I kind of have fill in with some of the psychology. So we're so glad that you were maybe part of our dinner tonight, our dinner conversation. It's so great to be with you.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi and Peyton, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And stay well, stay curious, stay outside, and stay hopeful. We got seeds of hope planted today, and let's keep watering them and see where we go. We'll talk to everybody soon. Take care.